welcome back. We are joined today by Colonel Jacques Baud, who is a former member of the Swiss Strategic Intelligence Services, to discuss some of the changes both on the military front as well as the diplomatic front. And indeed, there has been a lot going on. So thank you for coming on.
That's my pleasure. Thank you very much for taking me back in your show.
So over the past weeks now, we've seen the front lines, collapsing faster. The Russian advances, territorial advances, are also increasing rapidly, allowing them also to encircle thousands of Ukrainian troops. So we see that there is this Russian progress on the front lines, and it seemed for a bit that the diplomatic path was looking like it was dead, but perhaps to avoid too much public scrutiny, the talks continued behind closed doors, at least between the Americans and the Russians, which have now seemed to reach a consensus around the basic format of what a peace should look like. How do you make sense of this peace deal? Because I guess it took you by surprise as well.
Absolutely. I think nobody was aware of that. As you, I was thinking that everything had more or less stalled in terms of diplomatic relations, but in fact, it was still going on. And there are a few things that we can say. Obviously, the military situation on the ground has been kind of a trigger for additional effort on the diplomatic side. Probably the Americans got alarmed by the rapid progress of the Russian forces. We had just a couple of days ago. Don't know exactly what is the status of Kupiansk at this stage, but essentially we had 7, I would say, major cauldrons that were going on in the between Zaporizhia and Kherson and Kharkov. So meaning that we had, let's say, the prospect for victories on the the Russian side, and no prospect for any capability to regain the territory or to, let's say, achieve some kind of success tactically or even operational level from the Ukrainian side. And I think that's the most worrying part of it, because obviously Ukrainian soldiers did fight, I mean, as they could with what they had, bravely. But the problem is that the Ukrainian army has no capabilities to rescue the soldiers once they are encircled, and they have no ability to recover the territory that has been lost. So we see that we are reaching the point that has been, in fact, we warned about it already months ago, that the Ukrainian lack the capacities of having a maneuver capability, I would say, in their armed forces. They are able to defend static positions, but they lack now all the ability to react dynamically with, for instance, armored strike, armored counterforce, and even air force. So that probably was the rationale behind the American efforts to do something, to achieve something. And now this document that we have seen, now we have the 28 points have been published. So we know what is the substance of this agreement. And by and large, there are a few points that they're probably still questioned by the Russians, but by and large, it's a document that goes in the direction of what the Russians wanted. Meaning that the Americans, considering that this document was discussed between a small team in the US with Kirill Dmitriev, the special envoy of Vladimir Putin, that means that there is at least some kind of agreement on the Russian side on it. Probably not totally, but at least to some extent. Because again, when we talk and you discuss such an agreement, and I've done that many times, both parties have to do some kind of compromise, and a compromise means that you don't fulfill exactly what you want. You have to give something to the opposite party. So, meaning that there are a few points that probably needs to be sorted out by the Russians. But again, this document, by and large, is a document that goes very much in the direction of the Russians, meaning that by contrast, we can say that it's something that is probably not in favor of Ukraine, or probably not in favor of Ukraine in the sense that what Zelensky wanted, because and what the Europeans obviously wanted, and we saw the reaction from Kaya Kalas and Zelensky himself, who said that this is unacceptable and things like this. The problem is that last time they did so, that was in April. I mean, that was not last time, but one of the previous time when they did refuse such an agreement, or let's say withdraw the proposal, and that was in April 2022. The agreement was far from unacceptable, in my view, and Ukraine would be much better off if they had accepted, if the Europeans had not forced Ukraine to withdraw its proposals. So now we are there, and I think if Ukraine wants to withdraw from that, or no, withdraw, it's not about withdrawing because it is not a proposal. But if Ukraine doesn't want or refuse such a deal, well, probably the situation may be even worse for Ukraine, because the Russians on their side have been already, they have the experience of previous agreements that were not fulfilled by Ukrainians and the West in general. Therefore, they continue fighting as long as Ukraine doesn't accept the agreement. So the more you wait, the less options you have, and the worse your situation will come.
Well, of course, as you mentioned, Zelensky has already signaled that he does not want this deal. One of the representatives of Ukraine at the United Nations also outlined where the red lines were, what they couldn't accept, which was essentially all the main points. That is, Ukraine restoring its neutrality was rejected. The the limitations on the Ukrainian army was rejected. The seizing territories was rejected. So essentially everything of importance. Now, but of course, on the Russian side, I think there's also some hawks who not think. I know there's a lot of hawks who are not happy with this because they fought for almost 4 years in a war of attrition. They destroyed the Ukrainian army. They essentially destroyed everything that NATO could throw into this. They sustained the economic battle. So, this was a victory. So after this very painful victory, which they paid a heavy price, many would like to see more of their objectives being reached, even in the territorial issue, given that there's very little trust that NATO is going to actually live by this deal. So they would like to have the additional territory, that is everything from Kharkov, Dnipro, Nikolaev, Odessa, as a guarantee. But of course, I think Putin has enough support to withstand and push against these kind of pressures. But for Zelensky, though, it's not as if he can just reject this and go back to the way things were. I would expect Trump to put a lot of pressure and punishment on Ukraine if it doesn't follow through, if it is not willing to cede anything at all. Or do you think this is factored in, that Americans will now essentially put pressure on the Ukrainians to accept this deal?
It's hard to say, because on the US side, I'm not sure Trump has unlimited freedom of movement on that. You still have the neocons who are pushing. You have the same thing as in Moscow. In fact, you have the neocons pushing for more war. The idea being, and that's something that is not completely new. That's something we have heard in Europe many times. That means that yes, we know that Russia is not defeated yet, but it cannot sustain war for a very long time. Therefore, we can provide support to Ukraine for as long as it takes, and they don't care about what is the fate of Ukraine. But the idea is to maintain a state of war with Russia in order to deplete the resources of Russia. And they even say, well, that may last for years. I'm not sure that the Europeans are willing to do so because they have an economy. I mean, I have to be careful here. On the European side, you have two aspects. You have the rational aspect that says that the economy can probably not support such, let's say, more support to Ukraine. But on the other hand, if you listen to the European leaders, they don't think rationally. There is a kind of irrationality in their narrative, in the rhetoric they developed, and especially very recently. I mean, they are extremely. They have an extremely hawkish rhetoric, and it has become even more hawkish in the last 6 months. I would say that it has been even before. So there is a growing discrepancy between the political rhetoric and the economic capabilities to sustain the support to Ukraine. So that's where I have, in my view, a big question mark, and I'm not able to understand. On the U.S. side, it's almost the same thing, because Trump wants to make America great again. That's the objective. And he knows that he cannot be involved in conflict because that will absorb resources. So he wants to get out of the conflict, and he probably is on the path to succeed in that. The problem is that others, neocons, and want him to continue the support to Ukraine and to continue to contain or make some kind of containment of Russia in some way through sanctions and all that. So, meaning that I'm not sure that Trump has as I said before, unlimited freedom of movement there. On Russia, I fully agree with you. There are also people who want to gain the full benefit of the blood that was shed during those 4 years, and they are ready to continue this war until the complete destruction, probably not complete destruction, but at least to gain more territories. We can talk about Odessa, we can talk about Nikolaev. I mean, to cut Ukraine from the Black Sea and to regain those territories that used to be Russian historically. But this is a matter of decision here, because now we have reached some kind of probably not an optimum or optimal point at this stage, but we are close to it, in a sense that the document we have now shows that the Americans have made a big step in the direction of Russia, even if it's not perfect, but there is a big step forward. A few aspects that are still, let's say, denied or refused by Ukrainians, such as NATO and all that. This has already been off the table for a long time. Even Biden in 2022 told Zelensky that Ukraine will not be part of NATO. So, if it's not part of NATO, it remains the option of being neutral, as the 1996 Ukrainian constitution said. And that's probably it's not an absurd and a completely how to say that? Yes, absurd a possibility for Ukraine. But and again, I think nobody already wants to take the risk of being involved in a conflict with Russia, especially that NATO countries are not able to sustain or would not be able to sustain a full-fledged open war with Russia. So, meaning that um, you have the question of NATO, despite all the objections of Ukraine, I think they have to understand that this is already gone. That's now the problem of territory is probably the most serious one, because of course Zelensky paid a very heavy price to keep territory, because this idea that Russia would had the objective to take the whole of Ukraine made the Ukrainian military command to focus on keeping every or protecting or defending every square meter of Ukraine, and even that was done at a very heavy price. And now, if they have to just give up the rest of Zaporozhye and Kherson for nothing, this would be that would be probably considered by many Ukrainians as a kind of insult, and and probably Zelensky probably would not survive this. I mean, probably physically. I don't know, but this is something he probably thinks about it. So we are now in a situation where everybody has something to lose with this agreement, and everybody has something to gain with this agreement. The problem is to make the balance between what you lose and what you gain, meaning that we are reaching some kind of optimal point. I used to be advisor to a foreign ministry in Switzerland, and we used to say that a good agreement is when both parties are unsatisfied of the agreement. And we are probably in that situation now. I mean, I haven't seen an official reaction from the Russians on that document. We have seen, but the Ukrainian and European reaction was just no. So it's just 100% no. So it's not substantiated. It has no substance. On the Russian side, I haven't seen anything, but I can understand that you will have objection from both sides, and that's probably the sign that the agreement is probably not so bad. Probably you have to hammer out a few points and to discuss a few things. And obviously, the Russians will not be fully satisfied, nor the Ukrainians, but probably that's the sign that is something that that probably could be a long-term solution. Again, I don't know. It's up to the parties to decide. But we have also to understand that this document was elaborated, obviously, at the initiative of the Trump administration somehow, meaning that right now, Russia is benefiting of a goodwill from the US. And if the Russians deny flatly or refuse flatly such a deal, they may not have in the future the same goodwill from the US side. So they probably have to consider this aspect also. And that may probably add some weight in a decision in one direction or another. So these are the points I think that are important to consider. Uh, no agreement will be perfect. And we see that the issue here is not just to have an agreement for the next 6 months, but to have something that lasts for years, and something the Russians and the Ukrainians can live with. And that's the issue. And therefore, we have, when we see this, I mean, when I saw this agreement first, I said, well, the Russians will not accept that because of certain points, which, in my view, could be very controversial on the Russian side. But again, if you look at it in the long run, and you say, well, if if we accept minor issues or points that are not completely satisfying us, but which can provide a lasting solution, probably there is some trade-offs here. And again, when you negotiate so complex situation for the long run, especially in the mood that we have right now in Europe, which is totally against any kind of agreement. Because if you listen to Kaya Kallas, because again, the Europeans have not provided any bit of solution for this conflict. Zero. They just promoted the idea of providing new weapons and things like that, but that's all. Diplomatically, they've done nothing because they don't want to do anything. As a result, the mood in Europe is not in favor of any agreement. Zelensky is probably not in the mood to have an agreement either, because probably because of the pressures that are in the country now. We see what we have, the political turmoil we have right now in Kiev is probably not in favor of Zelensky. We see that there are more and more opposition to Zelensky in the country. You have more and more people who want to stop this conflict because they are tired. There is a fatigue of this agreement. By the way, we see that also in Russia. It's probably less obvious because Russians, I mean, the Russians from the Russia itself. I mean, I'm not talking about those oblasts that have been gained in Ukraine by the Russians, but the original Russia, if you want. Um, they are kept away from the conflict, and that was a deliberate strategy of the government to keep the life as much as possible as usual, to avoid people to be uh, to how to say that, to suffer from the conflict in various ways. So you see that in the stores and all that, you basically you have a life as usual. Therefore, people are not directly affected by the conflict. But if you look at the polls, and especially those, if you can even go on the website of the Levada Center, who, by the way, is considered as a foreign agent by Russia, but it makes every month a survey about the perception of the conflict. It is a very interesting, let's say, information, because you have, since the very beginning of this special military operation, you have every month the same question that are asked to the people, and that allows to have very interesting comparisons in the mood of the population. And you see that basically the special military operation still enjoys a wide support in Russia. I mean, something like 75-76% of support for the military operation. But at the same time, you have a growing number of people who are in favor of a negotiated solution to the conflict. And recently, just in the last month, in October, the willingness for negotiation has decreased a little bit, but by and large, you have a broader interest or willingness to have a negotiated solution to the conflict. Meaning that on both sides, even if it's stronger in Ukraine than in Russia, on both sides you have a fatigue which is understandable, by the way. Meaning that this comes also into addition when you take the pros and cons to accept such a deal or not, and that will affect both sides. So I think again, I cannot say what the Russians will decide. The Ukrainians probably to think about this proposal before say a definitive no. The Russians will most certainly think about it very seriously, and will probably be more smart in in a few days when we'll have the response. I mean the real assessment of of the Russian government on that. So again, I think everything is open at this stage. And I would say probably Europeans have to think about it also, because I'm not sure they can gain more than what you have in this document. That's my personal view.
Well, you mentioned that in a good compromise, neither side will be completely happy. But obviously, this agreement is skewed in Russia's benefit. But again, peace agreements should reflect reality, and you can't have Russia winning the war and then somehow meet exactly at the middle. I mean, for Kaya Kallas and uh, her kind of people, she made the comment that Russia's an aggressor and Ukraine is a victim, so this is not fair. Ukraine should be able to dictate the terms. I mean, it's a very even if one buys into the argument that Russia is simply the aggressor, it's still a very normative way of looking at the world as opposed to how it actually is. But you did mention that this is for many reasons controversial on the Russian side. I guess one area I picked up on was that in this key plan, it's framed now as a Ukraine-Russia war. Now, one of the problems with this framing is that a lot of the assumptions is that NATO can play the role simply as a guarantor, as opposed to one of the participating sides in the conflict. So, for example, the agreement allows for NATO to build up large amounts of long-range weapons, which can be stored, for example, in Poland and shipped directly into Ukraine if Russia would start the war. But of course, if Ukraine starts the war, then the US will not be bound by any of these commitments. But all of this is premised on the idea that NATO or the US, the West, will honor the obligations as they're stipulated. But if we accept that NATO is a part of the conflict, if I was sitting in Moscow, I would be worried, because now NATO can still, in the future, if it decides to put pressure on Russia, it can always activate the Ukrainian front, that is to trigger another war and then just pump in hundreds if not thousands of long-range missiles into Ukraine to bring devastation upon Russia. So it's there's a lot of these issues which would be of concern, which could have been probably or maybe addressed in a better way if NATO was recognized to be a participant here. But anyways, I digress. I wanted to ask you though, what are these controversial issues on the Russian side, as you refer to them?
Oh, yes, just before answering your question, just come back to NATO, because I think it's important. Of course, we mentioned several times that NATO is a party to the war and all that. But let's be clear, NATO, as opposed to the European Union, NATO can only decide collectively. I mean, Mark Rutte cannot decide anything. He has no power. He's just a secretary general. Essentially, in NATO, the US decide, essentially. Meaning that not having NATO in the discussion is logic. It's like the UN, essentially. The UN cannot decide. I mean, the Security Council, they can decide where you have the US and the five Ps, but the UN as an organization has a very limited decision capability, the same as NATO. In fact, we should more talk about NATO countries. NATO is mentioned in this document because obviously that describes collectively all the European partners of NATO. I mean, European allies of NATO. And that's a way for Russia to address all of them in one shot. But NATO is at the end, if you have missiles or things like that, I mean, the US will be involved, and that's the reason why it's probably good to maintain the US. I mean, or good or bad, it depends how you see it. But nevertheless, I think the US in the last phase of this conflict is the only country that has shown some kind of rationality, some kind of, I'm not sure it's totally rational, but there is some kind of rationality in that. And that's probably good because when it comes to missile, those anti-ballistic missile that we had in Poland and Romania, which are dual use capable. I mean, they can be anti-ballistic or ballistic. These missiles are American. So meaning that, in fact, if you have an agreement between Russia and the US, that's enough. I mean, in essence. And that's the difference with the European Commission, because the European Commission, I mean, the European Union can decide. I mean, Ursula von der Leyen can make a decision, while, again, her counterpart or half counterpart, Mark Rutte, cannot. Anyway, I think it's important to remember this because that explains why, by the way, NATO as an organization was never really involved in the conflict. You had NATO countries. Remember when you had security agreements with Ukraine, those were bilateral. They could not be collective because NATO, even if you have in all these bilateral agreements, you have all NATO countries, by the way, in essence. But NATO as an organization cannot be involved because at the end of the day, the US decide. While if you have bilateral agreements, that means that each country can decide independently. And that's, by the way, that it also shows why NATO at one point should be the mere purpose of NATO should be discussed in Europe. That's it's at the one time on one hand, it's the strength of NATO because it puts all the countries under US nuclear umbrella, but it's a weakness in the sense that this device, I mean, NATO as a device, is not suited to solve conflicts such as the one in Ukraine. It has never been designed for this, and we could see, by the way, that it was even very weak in Afghanistan. Of course, you had NATO countries involved there, but the command structure and all that is not tailored for war under the nuclear war, in fact. But anyway, that's that's one aspect. Coming back to your question, I think certainly something that struck me was the use of the frozen assets, as an example, because it is clearly said in the agreement that the frozen asset would be used for the reconstruction of Ukraine. So I'm not sure that is something the Russians would accept, because first of all, these are assets that belong to the Russian people, not to those who have crafted the agreement. That's the first step. And secondly, I think the idea of the Russians is to say to put the Europeans facing their responsibilities. When the Europeans asked Zelensky to trade peace against a support for as long as it takes, the Europeans have taken a responsibility. And I think the Russians are very clear that this responsibility should be assumed by those who have, in fact, created the problem. Because in April 2022, the Zelensky proposal was almost accepted by the Russians. It was almost signed, and the Europeans asked Zelensky to withdraw its proposal. And had the Zelensky maintained his proposal, we would not have this discussion today. Ukraine would have the same shape as it had at the time, with some discussions that were still pending on the Donbass and Crimea. But by and large, you would have the Kiev would have sovereignty over all of the territory. Um, it would be neutral, same thing as is in this document, and so the same as it had in the previous constitution of Ukraine. So no real change, just commitment that Ukraine will no longer be an adversary of Russia, and no longer an adversary to the Russian people living in Ukraine, because that's also an important aspect. So meaning that uh, the Europeans have taken a huge responsibility in asking Zelensky to withdraw from this agreement. And at the same time, the Europeans have committed themselves to pay for it. So why should Russia today pay for what the Europeans have committed to pay? So I think that's an important point. Again, that's my feeling. Probably the Russians. I'm not in Moscow. I'm not advising the Kremlin, but I would. This is certainly something that, in my view, the Russians would refuse. That's one aspect. And then there are probably other aspects. This is the most important element that struck me. I'm not sure that the Russians are very impressed by the idea of having sanctions relieved or things like that. It's certainly a plus for them in a certain sense, but at the same time, if you remember what Vladimir Putin said last year in December, to the meeting of the industrialists and the Russian industrialists and trade union and things like this. He said that the Russia should not count with a relief of the sanctions. So the sanctions are systemic in essence, and I think he even said that it is an opportunity for Russia. And it's very interesting because it's also something you see in China, for instance, that even though, for instance, when you have this ban on microchips from the US, now the Chinese have even from themselves. They've banned US microchips because they have noted that, in fact, those sanctions have a positive aspect because they provide some kind of stimulus to the domestic industry to compensate for the lack of these equipment, meaning that the sanctions in fact, are probably a way to boost some aspect of the economy, and that's exactly what Vladimir Putin said 1 year ago. So I'm not sure that is something that the Russians are extremely impressed by, because they say, well, we have learned to live with sanctions. By the way, we have new trade arrangement now with no longer with Europe, but with the rest of the world. And probably even if you have now an agreement between Russia and Ukraine, that will probably not necessarily involve the what the Europeans want with Russia. And my feeling is that if we listen to Kaya Kallas and others, I'm not sure that the Europeans are in a mood to improve their relationships with Russia. On the contrary, and even if we have an agreement now that has been brokered by the Americans, the Europeans will even be more harsh towards the Russians. So, meaning that for the Russians, this issue of sanctions, it's probably not an incentive for them. Uh, Again, they live without. They have now improved their ties with China. They have more integrated, not completely, but there is a move towards economic integration in various areas between China and Russia. The Russia has found new markets in the rest of the world. As a result, they don't need Europe anymore. By the way, it's also a way for the Russians to punish Europe, because at the end of the day, if Europe doesn't want to have or to improve economic relation with Russia, well, at the end of the day, the Europeans are paying the price for it. The German industry will pay the price for it. It's still paying, is already paying the price for it. So the Russians are probably not in a hurry to resume the traditional economic ties with Europe. Now, the Europeans have wanted to exacerbate the conflict. Well, now they will pay the price for it. So again, all these elements, in my view, are things that the Russians may say, well, we don't need necessarily that. Um, and again, this is more in the area of economics, I see, where I see that Russia may not show a lot of enthusiasm. I may be wrong. It's probably my perception, but this is something, because here, if you read the text, you can see that even the U.S. tried to have more tried to use those funds, frozen assets, for developing industries in the U.S. So it's MAGA. MAGA is coming back in the agreement, of course, but that's logic. I mean, the Americans are brokering this agreement, so they want to get some benefits of it. I understand that. And by the way, they ask for compensation to the U.S. So we see that the U.S. is not completely innocent in this conflict. They also want to have to extract some benefit for themselves. Again, I can understand that, but this may not be an incentive for the Russians to do that. They don't need that, and they can probably live without that. So now the alternative is, of course, to say, well, we are not happy with this conflict, with this agreement. We'll continue to fight for a while, and please study more. I mean, we can rework that agreement, and have this rethinking of the agreement in the light of what's happening on the field, and probably the Americans will probably be forced to modify some clauses of the agreement. Again, I don't know.
Well, I can understand why the Ukrainians would be very unhappy with this American approach because, as you suggested before, the Ukrainians had a pretty good deal back in March and April of 2022 with the Istanbul Agreement. So uh, it was the Americans and the British who approached Zelensky and convinced him to
And the Europeans.
walk
And
away
the
for this peace
Europeans.
deal, and the Europeans as well, especially the British. And in return, they would give Ukraine all the weapon it would need to win. Again, they would fight with the Ukrainians, and they would make Zelensky, a new Churchill. They would, this would be a guaranteed victory. The NATO would put its full support behind Ukraine, and now the U.S. is seemingly prepared to put a lot of pressure to punish Ukraine if it does not accept this peace deal, which is extremely horrible, especially when compared to what Ukraine could have achieved in Istanbul if they had not given in to all this American pressure. Just on the sanctions, though, you mentioned that the Russians could see the sanctions as an opportunity. But also Putin made a comment to the Americans, because the Americans are also, they would like to get the sanctions out of the way, as you said. But Putin made the comment that Russia did not quit the US dollar or US banks. It was the US dollar and the US financial system that quit Russia by putting these sanctions. So I think given that the overarching concern of America is the rise of BRICS and post-American financial order or economic order, that this is what they would like to possibly integrate Russia into the unipolar world. That's probably one one bridge too far. However, from Maria Zakharova to Dmitry Peskov, they're all suggesting that, the Americans hasn't sent them anything. They're just reading the media reports like we are, allegedly. I'm sure they have some more information, given that they're the one who've been talking to the Americans. But nonetheless, it appears that the thinking might be that even if they have concerns, that they don't really have to raise these concerns yet, because if Ukraine rejects, why get on the bad side of Trump with smaller details if Zelensky is going to give a blanket rejection of all the key issues? So why not sit back and have the Americans put pressure on Zelensky to fall in line? What I thought was interesting, you mentioned the finances, that I also picked up on this, and listening to what Russian politicians and the Duma are saying about stealing the Russian funds, that they want all this money back. I also have a hard time imagining them willing to not just cede the money, but essentially handing it over to Ukraine. This is hard to believe. On the other hand, one could say that given that the Americans will not recognize Zaporizhia and Kherson as being Russian, it is conceivable that these funds to rebuild Ukraine would be the Russian side of that side, especially given that the battlefield is on the Russian side. That is, the territory is taken by Russia, is where most of the damage has been. I just assume that this would be the natural compromise, that Russia would help to rebuild the territories it has taken, and the Europeans can pay for on the other side of the new borders. But I wanted to ask you though, with the Europeans, they're also putting up a fierce resistance. They seem to do everything they can now to block this. Reportedly, they're working with Zelensky to come with a counter proposal, which essentially will be a Russian capitulation. But while they need the consent of the Ukrainians, is it possible for the Americans and the Russians to get the Ukrainians on board and just overrun the Europeans? I mean, there's been reports in Politico. Someone said from the American side that, who cares what Europe thinks? Do you think this is the prevailing sentiment?
Oh, there are two things. First of all, and that connects to the issue of the frozen assets, because just a few weeks ago, that was end of October, if I'm not wrong, when it was all this discussion about what to do with the frozen assets. You may remember that the Belgian Prime Minister, Bart de Wever, made a kind of a press conference, a discussion with journalists, explaining why Belgium is very cautious about using those frozen assets and giving them to Ukraine. And an interesting aspect is that he said, well, in war, it's the winner who decides what to do with the frozen assets, not the one who loses. Meaning that obviously he had in mind that there is no discussion. The Russians are winning, and they will eventually decide what to do. And if they reclaim their assets, and since those assets are simply frozen, basically they should be given back immediately. And that was the concern of Bart de Wever. He said, well, if the Russians ask to have those assets immediately, we will not be able to do it. So we need to have guarantees from other European states that Belgium, because since the bulk of this, I mean, something like 180 billion euros are in the Euroclear, that means that Belgium should give out immediately. Or it was about the total in Euroclear is 180, but the amount that was about to be given to Zelensky was 140 billion. But in any case, whatever the amount, the fact remains that Belgium should then give that money immediately. And the concern was obviously that the Belgium have in mind that the Russians will win, and therefore they will at one point ask that money, and if we don't have it, we will be in trouble. Meaning that there is probably, despite the official rhetoric that the Russians should be defeated and blah 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 blah, the reality is, I think, that behind the scene, people think, I mean, they have no illusion about what's happening. Um, and everybody understands that the longer this conflict will last, the worse will be the situation for for Ukraine, and therefore there is probably a need to do something. Now, the whole issue of this 10 the Zelensky's formula, the 10-point formula that he provided in November 2022, and that was presented to the various meetings in last year in 2024, and up to the famous conference in Switzerland, the conference in Bürgerstock, where they had to reduce those 10 points to 3 because obviously the 7 others were totally unacceptable. So, but the Europeans are still thinking in terms of this 10 points agreement. By the way, that's a byproduct of this 10 points formula that was presented by the Ukrainian delegation in March in Istanbul and in June. You may remember that the Russians came with this kind of memorandum where in fact, it describes the June 2024 Putin's proposal, but it's more detailed in that memorandum. And the Ukrainians came back with a solution which is halfway between the Keith Kellogg plan and the 10 point formula. So, meaning that the Europeans are still thinking about this formula because, in essence, as you rightly said, it requires the capitulation of Russia. And but that's the official language. That's Kaya Kallas. That's what they say in the press. But in reality, I think they all understand that things will not unfold like this, and that Ukraine is basically earmarked for defeat. And the problem is, how can we make defeat as easier to support for Ukraine as possible? I think that's what is in the behind the scene. But again, since the Europeans don't want to disapprove themselves, they still keep to have the official rhetoric that there is no compromise and Russia should pay and everything. Exactly what Kaya Kallas said. I mean, there is an aggressor and there is a victim. Again, this is something history will tell, but in my view, this is an argument that is not shared by the Russians. And by the way, you have more and more voices or former OSCE observers and all that that came to the same conclusions as mine, that in fact there had been a provocation. The idea was to provoke Russian intervention in order to apply sanctions, because without this provocation, Russia would not come into Ukraine. And if they would not come into Ukraine, you could not apply the sanctions and you could not defeat Russia, because the idea at that point was that the Russian economy was so weak that with massive and a lot of sanctions that are applied massively in a very short period of time that would isolate Russia and make the whole system collapse. And that's exactly what the French Minister of Economy, Bruno Le Maire, explained on the 1st of March 2022. Is exactly what he said. So, meaning that people were convinced at that point that there was an opportunity to make Russia to collapse. And therefore, there had been a provocation on the same pattern on what we have seen in South Ossetia in 2008, where the Georgian government started a provocation against Ossetia, probably to have a situation close to the one we had in February 2022 in in Ukraine, but this didn't work out as they expected, and therefore they repeated the operation. And if you look at all the events that preceded the Russian intervention in Ukraine, you could see it's very similar to what happened in Georgia. They're all the same signs, the same indicators on both sides. So my personal view is that the Ukrainians got inspired by the Georgian model and tried to apply it. And for that reason, by the way, you may remember that Joe Biden knew that Russia would attack on the 16th of February. And why on the 16th of February? Because that's the precise day that was observed by the OSCE, where you had this massive increase of shelling of the Donbass by Ukrainian forces. And Joe Biden thought that it would trigger an immediate response for Russia. It took about 8 days before Russia could decided to intervene. But it's interesting to see that Joe Biden, just days before the 16th of February, said he knew that the Russians would attack on the 16th, meaning that. And again, I don't want to come back with all this famous interview of Alexei Arestovich of the 18th of March 2019 that describes all the process that would unfold in 2022. And in fact, even in this interview, 3 years in advance, Arestovich said that the conflict would probably take place at the end of 2021 or early 2022, meaning that it was a provocation. And therefore, what the Europeans say today and what Kaja Kallas say, it's obviously the official rhetoric of that, but again, it has been a provocation. And therefore, I think the Russians, regardless of what people may think in Europe, whether it was a real provocation or not, I think the Russians are convinced that they were provoked into this operation. And by the way, we always talk as unprovoked. I mean, we talk every time we mention this intervention with unprovoked. I think it's too much there, to be honest. That means that it was provoked. That's my personal view, but this is my view. In any case, the rhetoric of the Europeans remains a rhetoric, but I'm not sure it will be supported very long by the facts. And they have no leverage on Ukraine, basically. I mean, they can only say they will support Ukraine, but they don't have even the means to support Ukraine. In fact, all we have seen in the last, let's say, 2 months, with all these drones and the various pseudo attacks that we had, in fact, had as a purpose to maintain the attention on Ukraine to maintain the attention of the Americans, maybe even to provoke a more substantial response from the Americans to support, to continue the support to Ukraine. I remember that we had all these drone issue in Poland and all that, and just at the same time we had the Ukrainian prime minister asking for having a no-fly zone made by Europe above Ukraine. You had Zelensky coming with the issue of the Tomahawk missiles, an issue that it had raised before, but it came very strong in October with that, because that was based on all these kind of alleged provocation from the Russians. And because the Europeans don't have the means to do that. As a result, they needed to have a more substantial involvement from the US. The problem is that Trump doesn't want that, and therefore they had to find a way to force the US to change their policy and to keep involved with the Ukrainian conflict. That's all what now it has not worked out that way. And for that reason, we are now in a situation where the Europeans are powerless. They they cannot support financially, they cannot support militarily, they cannot support with equipment Ukraine, and therefore we are, despite all the rhetoric, I think the Europeans will be forced to admit that the situation is not in favor of Ukraine, despite of all the official narrative, and they will have at one point to obey, I would say, to the US. It's very significant that the whole discussion that we had, of course, as you rightly said at the beginning, it was all in the backstage and all that, but nevertheless, you still had US and Russia talking together with no Ukrainians, with no Europeans. And that means that Europe is not has no weight, in fact, in all that. By the way, it's not surprising. I mean, we had issue this year with Iran. Europe was absent. With Palestine, Europe was absent. I mean, with every issue, Europe is just talking, but does nothing, virtually nothing. And when you had, even when Europe has an issue with China, Kaya Kallas goes to China. What does she talk about? Russia, because there is nothing else in her mind than the problem of Russia. How can you work with those people? I mean, this is Europe has made itself irrelevant in this whole issue. It is irrelevant. It has it has come up with no initiatives. I mean, of course, under Biden, it was Biden, but with Trump, we have seen several moves. We I'm not sure they were all very smart and probably very clumsy from time to time, but at least you had an idea. You had an idea to solve somehow the problem, or trying to find a solution, even temporarily for Ukraine. But and again, we can blame the American, we can blame Trump for that, but at least they tried, while the Europeans have not even tried to do it. They have maintained the rhetoric they had since the very beginning of the crisis, and they stick to that rhetoric and stop. There is nothing more than this. I mean, no signs of appeasement. And by the way, that was said by Ursula von der Leyen during her address to the State of the European Union. I think it was September 2022, where she said no appeasement, no negotiation with Russia. And they have stick to that policy. So today, that there is no other solution. I mean, today there are two solutions: defeat of Ukraine or political solution. And since the Europe is not wanting to have a political solution, we are heading towards the defeat of Ukraine. But that's not what the US wants. Therefore, we still have a political solution, but without the Europe. It's very simple.
It seems that the main objective of Europe, as you said, is simply to keep the war going. And to do so, the ideal situation would be to end up in a, well, to play on Trump's desires to get an end to the war. That is, find a way of framing it as Russia opposing peace, which is why this unconditional ceasefire was such a great approach, because they knew that this, well, translates into ending the war without a political settlement, which is impossible for Russia. So it's a good way to, then get the Trump to put the pressure on Russia and get the relations to deteriorate, and then Trump would become Biden 2.0, which to a large extent he seemed to have become. But now, though, this is quite significant. Now that it has materialized in a very specific 28-point plan, it does appear that as long as Russia doesn't have to object to anything, because the Europeans and Zelensky are doing this already, I think, is we can expect the pressure campaign to start coming now from the US. Again, it can entail anything from cutting weapons, intelligence, logistics. There's a lot of places where the pressure can come. So it will be fascinating to see how this will impact Ukraine, because this happens, as you said, at such a critical time now that Ukraine is losing big time on the battlefield. This is really when they needed additional support. So this is a opportune time, I guess, for the Americans to do put pressure on them. Anyways, thank you so much for taking the time. Trump tends to put the whole world on this emotional roller coaster almost, as he treats the world as his personal reality show. But I guess now is some time for optimism that at least, something that seems like a reasonable, possible political settlement is within reach. But I do think we're still far away. So thanks again, Colonel.
I agree. Thank you very much for inviting me. Thank you. Have a good time.